西方哲学与宗教对话国际会议第一场专题演讲现在开始。
The first keynote speeches of the International Conference on Animal Liberation, Animal Rights, and Equal Ecological Rights, Dialogues between Eastern and Western Philosophies and Religions will now begin.
我们邀请华梵大学朱建明校长担任本场次的主持人，有请朱校长。
We now welcome Professor Jianming Zhu, the President of Huafan University, who will be the host for this session. Thank you.
好，谢谢各位参与啊。那这一场我们因为刚刚的延迟啊，所以我们从10点10分开始啊。然后按照大会的规定呢，就是希望由主讲人讲50分钟。不过我刚刚特别问了Singer 教授呢，他希望说能够开放一点时间给大家提问啊，所以我们大概会把演讲的时间设定在40分钟。所以待会讲完开放问题的时候，希望各位能够踊跃发问啊，我们大概有10几分钟时间开放出来。那Singer 教授，我想基本上是不太需要介绍，因为我们刚刚讲说，这次请来的几位学者呢，其实是在动保史上是属于这种 iconic figure 非常非常具有历史性代表人物的这个学者。那1975年的这个著作Singer 的 Animal Liberation 是一般称之为动保运动的圣经是 Holy Bible 那不过我刚刚跟Singer 教授讲，我其实更常使用的他一本书来当教科书叫做 Expanding Circle。我觉得那个跟儒家也好，跟佛家也好，可以相互沟通的地方，相互交流的地方更多不过基本上Singer 教授还是用西方近代最主要的一个哲学理论就是效益主义 utilitarianism 作为他的整个理性理论的一个基础所以我想在他整个热情投入在这个活动里面的过程，它其实背后有一个非常严密的一个哲学论证在里面。我想这里面在今天他的回顾现况与展望里面，大家应该都可以欣赏到。接下来我们就以热烈掌声欢迎 Dr. Peter Singer。
It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank all of those involved in the Life Conservation Association for making this conference possible and to make it possible for me to be again in Taiwan. I was here 12 years ago and it's very good to see the work that you are doing in spreading ideas about animals and animal liberation here in Taiwan. So I want to talk rather briefly about where the animal movement has come from and what we have achieved and where we are going to. So here is my title. And we begin by looking backwards to see what progress we have made. And I'm beginning today as in respect to the Buddhist traditions that are strong here and that are behind the LCA, with some Buddhist precepts, which, as you will see, are very different, unfortunately, from the Western foundations of religious teachings in regard to animals. So here we have, in the foundations of the Buddhist tradition, concern for animals, and this is still a living, important tradition, but we live in a world which has been very much shaped by Western traditions. So if we look at them, here's one more Buddhist tradition. But if we look at the Western traditions, we find something rather different. We find this quote from Genesis, from the Bible, which suggests that only humans are made in the image of God, and that they should have dominion over all the other creatures. And although recently scholars have reinterpreted this idea of dominion as a kind of stewardship, unfortunately, historically, it was interpreted as a permission to do almost anything we like with animals. And we find this also not only in the Bible, but in the roots of ancient Greek philosophy, where we find in Aristotle the idea that the rest of nature, the plants and the animals, exist really for the sake of human beings. And if we follow this on into medieval Christianity, we find the most influential philosopher of that time, Thomas Aquinas, is also presenting this idea that essentially animals do not matter. We can do what we like with animals because the only thing that really matters is human beings, and God has given us permission to treat them as we wish. So for thousands of years, this tradition has influenced the Western world, and then of course the Western world spread its influence over the rest of the world during the 19th century. If we move a little further, even to the end of the 18th century, we find Immanuel Kant repeating essentially a similar view to that of Thomas Aquinas, although with a different philosophical foundation, but still saying that humans are the end and everything else which is not a self-conscious being is a means to the end, and of course assuming that animals are not self-conscious beings. The first strong voice to oppose this in the Western philosophical tradition really comes from Jeremy Bentham, writing at about the same time as Immanuel Kant, at the end of the 18th century and in the early 19th century. And Bentham raised this very important question. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So here we come back, if you like, to the ancient Buddhist ideas that suffering, the capacity to suffer, is what is important. And if you're capable of suffering, then you are a morally significant being, and it does matter how we treat you, and whether we add to your suffering or try to reduce that suffering, or even prevent it. So this happens, as I say, at the beginning of the 19th century in England in the utilitarian tradition. And then we get another very important influence developing with Charles Darwin, the founder of evolutionary theory. This comment here is from his notebooks. He didn't actually publish this at the time. If you look at the date, it's from the 1830s. He only published The Origin of Species 20 years later, and The Descent of Man another 13 years after that. But already he was saying to himself that man is arrogant to think that our creation alone comes from God and the rest of nature is somehow a separate creation. And Darwin recognizes here that we are created from animals and that we have therefore a kinship with animals, that we are more like them and they are more like us than we like to admit. And here's a quote from his most significant work, The Descent of Man, where he recognizes that animals can feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery, that we see this as we see it in our own children. The fact that they cannot reason to the same extent that we can does not mean that they do not feel pleasure and pain in just the same way that small children cannot reason in the same way that we can, but they still feel pleasure and pain. So that's the past, that's the background from where we've come. And it's important to see how far we've come, because then we can see what a really revolutionary change the animal movement is demanding. And we can understand how important this is, and also why it cannot happen overnight, why it must take some time for these changes to be accepted and implemented. So what I call the mainstream view here is the view that it's wrong to be cruel to animals, and it's good to be kind to them. But cruelty here is understood as doing things which inflict pain for no useful reason, which inflict pain perhaps just for entertainment, like for sport, and not in the process of producing food, for example. So this mainstream view says we don't really have to be concerned with their interests, or at least not to the same extent that we must be concerned with the interests of human beings, even when they have similar interests, like the interest in not feeling pain. This is the alternative view that I have defended in Animal Liberation and in other writings since, that animals have interests, certainly vertebrates, but I think some other animals as well, and we are not justified in giving less consideration to the interests of animals simply because they are not members of our species. So the correct moral principle for dealing with animals is that of equal weight to similar interests, irrespective of species. The pain of an animal counts just as much as the pain of a human being. And that means we reject what I call speciesism. Speciesism is the idea that we're entitled to give preference to beings because they're members of our species, or perhaps of some other favoured species. For instance, we could have speciesism in saying we shouldn't cause pain to dogs, but it's all right to cause pain to pigs or cows or chickens. That would also be speciesism. And I use this term to suggest the parallel with racism, which we reject, and sexism, the idea that giving preference to the interests of beings of your own race or your own sex is something we now think of as wrong, but I'm suggesting that we should also regard it as wrong to do it on the grounds of species. Of course, it's important that animals are conscious and can feel pain, but I think this is something that we generally all understand now because of the similarities between us, both in behaviour and in their anatomy and physiology, and of what we know about our common evolutionary origins. I said before that I think it's clear that all vertebrates are capable of feeling pain. Exactly how far we ought to go here is not so clear. I think, if you like, we have diminishing levels of confidence as we move down this list. So I think